Hi, I'm Roland. I'm one of the co-founders of SET. We're an arts organisation that runs meanwhile use projects across London, and we also provide affordable arts workspace.
Hi, I'm Nichole from Second Floor Studios and Arts. I'm Chief Exec and co-owner. We provide affordable workspace for artists and makers. It might be useful to explain what LAASN is. LAASN stands for London's Affordable Artist Studio Network, and we brought together the chief execs and kind of studio managers of studio providers so that we can support each other, because we do an awful lot with very little. Part of the reason why we set up LAASN was because we wanted to reclaim the voice of the sector, and we wanted to redefine conversations about what was good quality studio provision and what was really affordable, because we were watching people charging over £35 a square foot and saying that they were affordable. So we then started, because we formed LAASN, we had our own data set group. So we were actually like, let's do some inquiry into actually how much space we're all running, what we're charging, so we can kind of amongst ourselves get to a position of, well, where are our rents sitting and what challenges are we facing, and are we including or excluding electricity, obviously with the crisis that happened a couple of years ago. So there's all kind of, that picture comes into the data, and the most recent data that summarises 2024 is that we've got 8 big organisations or main organisations within LAASN. We're operating 1.2 million square feet of workspace in London.
Workspace.
It's an awful lot of workspace, and that represents 65 sites, and it's about 2,200 studios, and we're looking after about 3,200 humans. That's approximately 1 in 3 artists working in London that have workspace, and we're operating in 60% of the boroughs.
I think the other thing to say is that as the experts, because we've all been running these organisations for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, 40 years, some of the organisations have existed since the 60s, we really are both the experts and the voice of the sector, and that's why it's important that we kind of speak for what our own data, which we're doing right now.
Only last week I was seeing reported that we have lost half of our workspace in the last 10 years.
So I must admit, on Tuesday I gave a talk in which I said that we were losing space left, right and centre in London, because that is the narrative, and that's the narrative I understood to be true too. But what you're saying is essentially we're talking about there being more affordable workspace.
So there's been this growth up into 2014, and then we're told from 2014 to 2024 we're going to lose half of our workspace.
Yeah.
However, I've extrapolated from our most recent LAASN research.
Yeah.
I've included 3 organisations that are not part of LAASN, but I've managed to get hold of their data, and I put our sector at 2.8 million square feet.
So we're talking, if anything, potentially a loss of 100,000 square foot, but yeah, basically stable.
And how much of a surprise?
Yeah, it's totally shocking to me.
We want to put out data that is the raw data that is accurate. We believe that the sector is still around 2.8 million. I mean, you could argue that it should have grown and not stabilised, but we definitely haven't seen 50% loss. I mean, within this, there are really critical factors. There is displacement, there's churn, but we are backfilling. And as LAASN, we've grown 6 to 7%. 6 to 7%, not 67%.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
That's your territory.
Yeah.
We have consistently grown. With the most phenomenally difficult circumstances, we still manage to open 2 to 3 new projects a year and work with this is an amazing stat. In 2004, when ACME did their first research, most of the studio projects were being run by volunteers or had the equivalent of 0.5 FTE.
Wow. And were they also better funded during that time? Was there better state funding?
There was definitely ACE funding around.
Yeah.
There was definitely.
As in Arts Council England, yeah.
Yeah, there was definitely more support that was being provided. But I think they were able, I mean, if you get into the data, you used to be able to rent buildings at sort of £2.20.
Yeah, which is like, it's never going to happen now in this
but that's the picture that used to also be there.
Yeah.
So you've got £2.20 and then you're trying to pass it on at about £8 to £12 a square foot. you see the numbers, but I'm pretty sure this 2.8 million is sound because the other data is so consistent. And if you just extrapolate some, and it's not a very long extrapolation of how you get to 2.8 million, but that is the conclusion that I have drawn, and I'm happy to be challenged on it. I'm sure I will be.
Nah.
But I think we are in a stable position.
So if we're in a stable position, I mean, we'll probably come on to this, but actually let's move on to it now, I think. If we're in a stable position, then what does that mean? What are the challenges? What does that mean for the kind of rent side of it? Are we seeing an increase in what we're charging per square foot?
The 2 points that I would want people to remember is I don't think we've had massive hemorrhage of space. We've definitely had displacement and churn.
Yeah.
But where the crisis sits, because there is still a crisis in our sector, is one of affordability.
Yeah, and I think that's basically what most of us are seeing, and those of us who are also practicing artists looking at studios, that seems to be the case. Everything's getting more expensive. So I think we want to talk a little bit about how to define what an artist studio is, because it's quite a complex area and there are a lot of pitfalls. Whilst in the past maybe you could delineate between artists and other sectors by saying, oh, they're painters or sculptors. A lot of artists are multidisciplinary practitioners now, and they also work across different portfolios, both commercially and non-commercially, to be able to subsidise and sustain their practices. I mean, so I think part of why we want to kind of delineate these two positions is because if you don't delineate the difference between an artist studio and a creative industries studio, the entire idea of what's affordable shifts upwards. So at the moment, part of the issue might be that because we don't have a good definition of what artist studios is, and we don't have a good definition of what affordability is, someone could say, yeah, £35 a square foot, that's affordable for someone who might be an architect or a framer or even potentially a florist, but that wouldn't be affordable for someone who doesn't have any means of making money from their practice, a non-commercial artist. So we tend to say that we support non-commercial practices, and in a way it's a self-defining subset, the subset of people who are all of those people who need to be to have affordable studios because their practices don't give them income or enough income. And if you look at what the average income for an artist is from their practice,
it's really consistent.
It's very, do you want to speak to that?
It's been about £10,000 to between £10,000 and £11,000 for a maker for the last decade. Yeah, per year, as a direct attribution to what they make in their studio. Fine art, it's more about 5,000-6,000, and that's been consistent for years.
So you're already talking, if you have one of the most affordable studios in London, maybe 50% of the income from your practice is already going to go on your studio. I mean, to a degree, that's not sustainable anyway, and we're going to talk a little bit more about actual rent positions now. But I think that's really important to capture the fact that there is a set of people in the world who need subsidy from organisations like our organisations and from the state too, and through funding, in order to be able to continue to make work. And most of those people, if we look a bit at your previous research, like only 8% of those people are going to be able to live off their practice in the future. So we also need to rethink what the arts are in London. It's not about becoming super successful and making loads of money. Some people will be able to do that, a very small set of people, but most people have professional practices that are doing important good art practices, but they're not going to make any money from it, and they need support to be able to do that for the foreseeable future. Otherwise, we just live in a world where no one's making any artwork.
We need to make a decision as a society.
Yeah.
Do we want to live amongst artists? It's not just about the cultural institutions.
No.
It's about artists living among us every day and feeding into discourse and interpreting what's going on in the world at the moment. And you're right, it's so important that artists have the opportunity, that they're not under pressure to make work. If they want to philosophically sit in their studio for a year and just think, about something, Matthew, my co-owner, he is passionate about, and has always been since he founded Second Floor almost 30 years ago, that if people for just their mental well-being want that space to think and reflect, that's just as valuable to society as whether or not there's output. And they are a group of humans that if we don't subsidise, we will lose from our capital. Should we get into the rent position?
Let's do it, yeah.
So what I've noticed, because again, from all these different reports, I've taken data points and compared it against the Consumer Price Index, the CPI.
Yes.
And if you look back to, I mean, these numbers are going to be quite painful to hear about what things cost in 2004. But basically, if you take that starting point of the average rent was £215 for a studio and £7.50 for a square foot, if you extrapolate that against CPI, our sector pretty much is aligned up until around 2019, 2020.
So up until COVID.
Yeah, we are in line, and before the invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. So we're seeing that give or take 50 pence, the studio average position is tracking against CPI.
So just explain, that's basically because inflation means everything goes up.
Yeah.
We were tracking the amount that it went up was tracked by what the cost of studios were, even though artists' income itself probably wasn't tracking CPI.
I haven't looked at the income position on CPI,
yeah, fine,
but as an example, so in 2022, our LAASN average position was 1775, CPI was 1559.
Okay.
But before that, if you look at the 2006 data, actually maybe, if you look at the 2006 data, the average position they're reporting was about £12 a square foot. Okay. And if you look at how that would have been tracked against CPI, it's not that far out. But what we're finding now, in 2025, we think the average affordable artist studio price point it's just gone over £20.
Yeah.
It's now £20.15.
So that's £20.15 per square foot per annum. So that means in a studio of, who can do the maths?
Okay, so the average
100 square foot.
So the average studio rent is £430, and the average studio size is £335.
So we're talking £430 a month, and that's 335 square foot. And for a lot of people, that won't be including electricity or.
No. So £430 is what's coming out as the average price point.
Yeah.
But that's not what costs. So a 335 square foot studio doesn't cost £430.
Right.
So these are just the averages that are coming out.
Okay,
they're not connected. So you've got an average studio value of £430.
Yeah.
An average studio size of 335 square feet. An average occupancy of about 1.2, 1.4.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
That's the aggregate kind of position.
Yeah.
If you're looking at the London living wage is around £14.
Yeah.
You can see why we need to start talking about affordability.
Yeah, because if the average price of a studio that people are paying is £430 a month, and your rent from London, your wage from London Living Wage
net would be about 23,000
per year. So what's that per month?
You're just tipping over 30% of your income
is going on your studio, which is unsustainable.
Yeah.
So even within LAASN, we are
noticing the challenges. We're noticing our cost base is moving, and there's a number of factors that we're feeling under pressure. But we are definitely seeing a divergence between CPI and what we're charging. And
it might be helpful to kind of talk about a couple of reasons why that is the case, because within SET, we're very much on the lower end of what people are charging, because they're meanwhile use projects, and we have this model. But even we have had to increase beyond what CPI would be, and we had to increase studio rent in Woolwich in 2021, and that was quite a painful process because electricity just went through the roof. Also, our building costs had increased when we were building Woolwich, because suddenly wood cost loads after the after the invasion of Ukraine. Those are probably the two main factors. Building is
and I think
staffing costs go up,
because obviously I won't pay anyone that's under the London living wage.
Yeah, of course.
Everyone has to get
London living wage.
So we're all finding that kind of cost pressure is ongoing. Plus, it's becoming more expensive to operate buildings.
Yeah.
Quite rightly, in some senses, you've got way more safety checks and monitoring. And you've got more sophisticated systems that you're having to look after, particularly in new buildings.
Yeah.
Potentially if you're looking after a lift, although, there's so much maintenance.
Lifts are really expensive.
There are so many maintenance challenges that are ongoing. But we're all trying really hard to keep things to the bare bones. I've observed an awful lot of people talk about, well, what is affordable?
Yeah.
And no one seems to be able to come to a position that everyone is satisfied with, because everyone will go, well, Kensington and Chelsea, affordable means one thing, Lambeth, it means another. And then if you roll everyone together, it's too generic.
Yeah.
So
well, you've created a formula.
I've created the Herbert formula.
The Herbert formula.
That I believe we can now actually start getting into some nitty-gritty about how to define affordability. It's not a very I'm a simple soul. It's not a very complex formula.
Is that true?
But it is, I think, a robust formula. I need to keep digging into it, but I believe that if we take baseline income, and you can take that at 3 price points. You've got the average salary for London.
Yeah.
You've got the reported bandings of salaries, and let's say we take the bandings of age 22 to about 39, because that's kind of a lot of our studio members
are within that age range.
Are in that age range.
Yeah.
And you take the London living wage.
Yeah.
So you take those 3 different income levels, and if you apply my formula, it spits out where you should be at affordability. The elements that as LAASN we need to come together and agree are, what are we pumping into the formula as the average studio size that we want to look at? I think it's 250 square feet.
Yeah.
Because I think that's kind of an entry, just over an entry level kind of size studio is 250.
Yeah.
And then we need to say, well, what percentage of income versus the space do we want to put in the formula, and that then punches out the price.
So to just explain that a little bit more, with the percentages, like how much of your earnings per month is it reasonable for someone to spend on a studio? And so you were saying earlier with rent, it looks like it's around 50% of people's income, if you're on London living wage, is going on rent already of your house, not of your studio.
Yeah, household income. The way that sort of a salary is split at the moment, it's about 47% is going on your household costs. So that's your council tax, your rent, your electricity, your gas, your water, your mobile phone bill.
So that's incredibly high.
Yeah.
And in itself unsustainable, and perhaps the affordable housing sector needs to start to create its own Herbert formula to reduce
this formula is absolutely, because you could, instead of putting a studio size, you could put a housing size. So you could say an average flat is 650 square feet, say. You could pump that in and you could tweak the formula. And it would spit out what your price per square foot would be that's actually affordable.
So the reason why this is important, and you were texting me about this last night.
I know,
last night. And so I was also getting my head around it, but we could immediately see the reason it's important is because at the moment what happens is people say, what's affordable? Well, affordable is a percentage of market rate, let's say 50% of market rate. But what if market rate is £60 a square foot?
Or it's in market failure. We have market failure.
Yeah, exactly. So you, whatever 50% of that is still more expensive than anyone could ever have for a studio. So you need to think of another way of defining what affordability is. And in LAASN, we've spoken for a long time about bottom-up pricing. The cost of running a building is what you'll charge in studio rent. And whilst that works to a degree, it's slightly vague, and also the cost of running a building could just be really high if someone just charges you loads of rent. It doesn't really tell you how much rent you should be being charged. What this formula can do is say, actually, if we're going to base things off London living wage, which people say is the amount of money people should be able to live off in London, and we all agree that people should be able to have access to an affordable studio, then how can we charge, what's the end amount that it's going to cost someone to have a studio, and then we work back from that position to work out how much we can rent a building off a council or for a new development or part of a Section 106 agreement.
But it means you can be so specific.
Yeah.
With this formula. I mean, I've shown it to a few people and they've just gone, that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes
It's really simple. And why didn't we do it before? And if you, I don't think anyone's going to be able to say no to this formula, because you can tailor it to your borough if you want to.
Yeah.
You can tailor it to a postcode if you've got the numbers and you've got the ONS data of what the salaries are. But you're right, if you have a 250 square foot studio, and you're on the London living wage, which after tax comes in, I think it's about 22.6k a year.
Yeah.
If you pump into the formula that you don't want that to be more than about 15%.
So that's 15% of what you earn is going on your studio.
That gives you that your studio at 250 square feet, the studio would be about £290 a month, and it would be at £13.78 a square foot.
So, for context, to £13.70 a square foot, 78 a square foot is, you know, that's kind of similar to the prices that Set is charging in general. We're probably going to have to move a bit above that position, and we can only do that on these meanwhile buildings. So at the moment, we're really far off being able to get to that kind of position. I think the kind of provisos that we might want to put in place is that we also realise that lots of people don't work full time and have an artist practice, and so therefore aren't on like 22,000 a year, up to 27 gross a year on London living wage. So we're aware of the fact that people would also maybe share those studios. But if we got to a position like that, where actually there were long-term studios that were £13.78 a square foot per year, we would be, well, how much less would we be now? It's about £7 less a year than we're charging at the moment. But I think
what it's demonstrating is that if you want to achieve that sort of affordability, you can't do it without subsidy.
No.
Because as LAASN members, we've just toppled over £20 a square foot.
Exactly, yeah.
So you've got a funding gap, and that's what we need the state to step in on, or funders to come in on and say, okay, how can we get you closer to £14-15 a square foot?
Yeah.
Because if you're coming up at £20, 20% of someone's income on London living wage, you would be £18.37.
Right, and that's
20%, and we're still as LAASN members over that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it just really shows how terrible the situation is.
You've got to anchor things back to people's income and reality. The market tells you, because we have market failure.
Yeah.
And then I think this really puts into context of what affordable is, and I would challenge anyone to suggest, because it's just such a simple formula, and it's anchored in income. I don't think you can argue with it. No,
well, I mean that's the kind of genius of the formula, is that it's also using a metric which has been defined externally as something which should be affordable for people to be able to live on, or a living wage, a wage that you're able to live on.
Yeah,
that's the genius of the formula. Now comes the bit where you have to. I'm not a genius,
but thanks. but what it does is you can take those at the beginning I was saying about those three different types of income. So you've got your mean position for London, your age grouped mean position, and your London living wage. That can be your high, your mid, and your lower point for pricing.
Yeah.
And then you can say, okay, let's do subsidy, and 50% of the project will be £14 a square foot.
Yeah.
And then the other elements of the project can be in those slightly higher brackets, but that's how we look at the range of pricing. And even if we said, With the higher earners, the average position of 47,500.
Wow, yeah. Is that the average position of higher earners?
In London, the earnings in London.
Yeah.
So even if you took that position and you applied the formula and it spat out the number of £28 a square foot, anyone that is charging more than £28 a square foot in our sector is not affordable, and we can finally draw a line under that.
Yeah.
And we can finally say, this is affordable. So if you've had grants, if you've had heavy subsidy, you should be below that threshold.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be a real shake-up for the artist studio industry, hopefully, and we can all... it's really a moment, essentially, of, I think, people who provide studios looking at themselves and saying, am I doing something that's beneficial or good? And am I doing something that's affordable for people? Or am I just doing something that's really expensive? And that's going to be quite... shocking, I think, to people when they actually look at it.
I'm hoping it will stop the appropriation of the word affordable.
Yeah.
Because some workspace providers are commercial, and that's fine, and they're doing, it's not taking away, detracting from the work that they're doing. It's great.
Yeah.
But when we say we have loss of artist workspace, it's not the physicality of the space, it's the affordability.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the central message, really, isn't it?